This video was brought to you by Ground News. Only a couple of years ago, Israel and the US were optimistic that peace in the Middle East could be achieved via the Abraham Accords. That is, the normalization of relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors, most notably Saudi Arabia. Motivated by mutual antipathy towards Iran, the Abraham Accords looked to be making good progress, and there was even hope that negotiations could survive October 7th. However, Israel's decision to restart its war in Gaza after a short-lived ceasefire was apparently the last straw for Saudi Arabia, and the kingdom has instead started moving closer to both Iran and other regional players like Turkey. So in this video, we're going to take another look at the Abraham Accords, how they collapsed, and how, instead of an anti-Iran axis, Saudi Arabia now looks like it's quietly building an anti-Israel axis. If you're interested in the political alliances and groupings that shape our world, then you might enjoy our poster, Every Alliance Explained. It shows, in slightly confusing detail, all of the world's major alliances and how different countries link together. Check out the poster by clicking the links in the description. So, let's start by going back to the latter half of Trump's first term. Back then, Trump's Middle East policy was centered around the so-called Abraham Accords. In other words, bringing peace to the region by normalizing relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Now, this might sound like a bit of a long shot, given the historical baggage, but there was cause for optimism. While Arab states were nominally supportive of a two-state solution, which has been the main point of tension between Israel and its Arab neighbors previously, they were less enthusiastic in their support for Palestinian statehood than they used to be, and therefore more willing to make a deal with Israel, despite no real two-state solution. This is in part because while Arab support for Palestine used to be motivated by a sense of Arab unity, as Hamas moved closer to Iran, the Palestinian cause started to look more like an Iranian proxy war. Anyway, in late 2020, Israel signed normalization agreements with Bahrain and the UAE, and there was talk of Israel eventually signing a similar deal with Saudi Arabia. While Trump didn't explicitly frame it in these terms, it was pretty clear that the Abraham Accords were in part about creating an anti-Iran axis between Saudi Arabia and the Arab states, and as such, Iran furiously opposed the deal. This is another reason that the US was optimistic about the prospect of Saudi-Israel normalization. Both countries were aligned against Iran, which had launched a successful drone attack on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities in 2019. Negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Israel continued quietly during Biden's term, and even in the weeks after October 7th, it still looked like normalization could be on the cards. Saudi Arabia's criticism of Israel was conspicuously muted, and there were reports that the Saudis would still be open to normalization if it received a NATO-like security guarantee from the US in exchange. Today, however, this has all changed. Not only has Saudi Arabia seemingly given up on normalization with Israel, but the kingdom is now moving closer to Iran. The turning point seems to have come in February, when the Gaza ceasefire collapsed and Israel resumed its assault on Gaza, while simultaneously talking up the prospect of forcibly expelling Palestinians from Gaza, with Netanyahu even suggesting a new Palestinian state inside Saudi Arabia. Almost immediately, Saudi state media, which had previously been relatively restrained, turned on Netanyahu, with a Saudi state news channel announcing that occupation does not have a good face and an ugly face. It only has one face, and it is Benjamin Netanyahu. Saudi Arabia has also become more vocal in demanding a two-state solution, and in March, the kingdom and other Arab states jointly presented an alternative plan for Gaza post-war, which was promptly rejected by Israel and the US. At the same time, the kingdom has been moving rapidly closer to Iran. In February, days after Israel restarted its assault on Gaza, the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers held a call to discuss regional issues. And earlier this month, Saudi Arabia's defense minister met Iran's leaders in Tehran, the highest level Saudi royal visit to Iran in decades. And during that trip, bin Salman delivered a letter from the Saudi king to Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, which apparently expressed support for both a Saudi-Iran security pact, which would have been unimaginable only a few years ago, and expressed support for the nuclear deal currently being negotiated between Iran and the US. This is a marked contrast from 2015, when both the Saudis and Israelis were staunchly opposed to Obama's nuclear deal and wanted the US to instead take a harder stance against Iran. And all of this suggests that the Saudis now see Israel, not Iran, as the main threat to regional security. It's also telling that Saudi Arabia has been mending relations with Turkey and President Erdogan, who has been one of the most vocal critics of Israel since October 7th. The two countries have rapidly deepened security ties in the last couple of months and tried to cooperate in Syria. Again, in part because they're both worried about Israel destabilizing the nascent Syrian state. And this is pretty remarkable. Saudi-Turkey relations have been relatively tense since the Arab Spring, and there was a fair bit of anxiety that when Assad's regime collapsed, that Syria would become a new point of tension. But so far the reverse seems to have happened. Now, of course, not all of this political maneuvering is motivated by Israel, and these trends do precede recent events. For example, the Saudi-Iran rapprochement we're currently seeing arguably began in 2021, with secret meetings in Iraq, as well as a China-brokered bilateral normalization agreement in early 2023. Similarly, Turkey has been trying to mend ties with the Gulf monarchies for at least the last few years, largely for economic reasons, and Saudi Arabia wants a more peaceful Middle East because it's in the middle of its own massive economic rebalancing. Nonetheless, the accelerating rapprochement clearly has something to do with Israel's bellicose posture, and it's worth comparing 2020 to 2025. Back in 2020, Iran's proxies were at full strength. The regime had just carried out a strike on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities, and the country was being led by hardliner Ebrahim Raisi. Israel, on the other hand, was mired in political crisis, and looked to be tentatively edging towards a more liberal politics. Netanyahu repeatedly failed to form a governing majority, and the only semi-stable government to emerge was a diverse coalition led by Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett, and existed between March 2021 and November 2022. Today, things look totally different. Iran's proxy network has been decapitated. Raisi has been replaced by reformist Masoud Pezeshkian, and the Ayatollahs are almost begging Trump for a new nuclear deal. While in Israel, Netanyahu has somehow managed to cling on to power, dragging Israel's domestic politics ever further right, while pushing for a regional war. In this light, you can see why the kingdom has apparently decided that today, Israel is the dominant threat to regional stability, not Iran. Ultimately, there's just a lot to unpack here, with this story reported on by more than 30 sources. Interestingly, we can see that 33% of those came from left-leaning outlets, while 40% came from outlets that lean right. Looking at the headlines, you can also see some differences, with left-leaning outlets focusing on the possibility of a détente, and the right-leaning coverage focusing more on the Iran nuclear talks. We're able to do that because of our sponsor, Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pulls back the curtain on media bias. Built by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from around the world and then organizes them each by story. For each and every story, you can see the number of sources reporting, where those sources lean on the political spectrum at an individual and group level, compare the headlines of each source, and read each article without ever leaving the app. But one of the best parts of the app is their blind spot feed. It presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what those on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. So if you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan using the link in the description, or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.